Oh, there we go. Okay, now I can see the audience. Okay, now I'm talking to some human beings. Great. Okay, let's get going. Okay, the biggest problem for beekeepers these days is this thing called the internet. And if you want to do a search on beekeeping, you come up with about 32 million results right there. By the time you've read the first 2 or 3 million of these, you're going to be so confused, you're not going to know what to do, because beekeepers are often very, very opinionated. And the problem with the internet, there's no editors to sort out the fact from fantasy or whatever. So you wind up with this. This is called the Gartner hype curve, and it comes. I based it upon this wonderful paper here. Hang on a second, let me hide these controls. By Denny and Kruger, actually published twice, called "Unskilled and Unaware of It: How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Lead to Inflated Self-Assessments." I'm not going to talk about politics right now, but let's go stick with beekeeping. And this happens with beekeepers. You start with your first hive, you put them in a box, you feed them some sugar syrup, they grow up, make a honey crop the first year, and at that point, you are at your peak of inflated self-assessment. And nowadays, this is when you start your blog, and you say, everybody else is an idiot. I don't know what they're talking about, that beekeeping is so hard. Look what I just did. And pretty soon you got 4 million followers following whatever dance or magic you did to keep your bees alive. And then Varroa, who's not paying attention to it at all, after a couple of years, builds up and kills your colonies. And then you hit the trough of disillusionment. And at that point, a lot of beekeepers get out of the saddle and don't start again. But just so you know, before Varroa, in our beginners classes, about 95% of the beekeepers who take beginners classes were not keeping bees 4 years later. Beekeeping has always been a real learning curve, even more so now with Varroa. And then if you do get back in the saddle, you get on the slope of experience and enlightenment. Now, I put down some years here. Usually this is like 2 to 3 years. This is maybe three to 10 years here. There are some beekeepers that are right here, first year beekeepers for 20 years. They just never, ever learn. They just buy new package bees every single year. But others decide, oh no, I'd rather keep my bees alive and not have to replace them every year and spend all that money. And this slope goes up as you slowly approach mastery of the craft. And I don't know any really experienced professional beekeeper who would ever consider themselves a master of beekeeping. I certainly don't consider myself that. And the beauty of this is this slope never levels out. You're going to have more questions when you die than you had when you started as far as beekeeping. So to me, that's one of the fascinating things about beekeeping. So let's simplify it right now. Let's just forget human beings at all. And let's just ask the bees, the honeybees, the rules for beekeeping from their point of view rather than our point of view. First rule, they need a warm, dry cavity. When the honeybees moved out of the tropics, just like humans did, you had to find cavities to live in, or you'd freeze to death during the winter. And I hear that you guys are probably getting some cold weather now, I guess. We just got snow the last few days here in where I live in California. So you need a warm, dry cavity. Humans lived in caves or built houses or teepees or wigwams. Honeybees moved into mainly hollow trees or rock cavities. Now, from a bee husbandry standpoint, this is pretty simple. The bees don't give a diddly squat whether they're in a Langstroth hive or a Worry hive or a top bar hive, or whether you paint your hive this color or that color or put what kind of roof on it. They just want a warm, dry cavity. So that's part's easy from the bee husbandry standpoint. Second rule is they need food, and their food consists of either pollen or nectar, or actually two of them together. From a bee husbandry standpoint, you have your choice of moving your hives to areas where there is pollen and nectar, or supplemental feeding, or just let them go into survivor mode, which they do just quite well in areas where you have long pollen and nectar dearths. So pretty simple there from a bee husbandry standpoint. Rule number 3 is they need to manage their parasites. And the problem is that we humans keep showing new parasites at the honeybees, parasites that they don't have a history to evolve with. Now, some of these, when you give them a new parasite, they can evolve fairly quickly. With tracheomite, it took about 5 or 6 years, and they evolved resistance to it. Nosema ceranae, there was about 5 years during its invasive wave when we had CCD, when it was really tough for the bees. When we get new strains of American or European foulbrood or chalkbrood, it can be really rough for the bees. And then in a couple of years, you get this transgenerational immune inheritance, and they can handle it. So they need to handle their parasites. And over the years, parasite management hasn't been that big a problem until this parasite arrived, the varroa mite. And as a biologist, I'm fascinated by this mite, which is an incredibly well-adapted parasite, and to see the evolutionary progression of our honeybees slowly evolving resistance to this parasite, and the progression of beekeepers slowly figuring out how to deal with this during that evolutionary transition. So from bee husbandry standpoint, most of you will not have access to stock of fully mite-resistant bees and will need to manage your parasites. In my operation, with our selective breeding program, we're up to maybe about 20% of our stock exhibits almost complete resistance to varroa, but the other 80% do need to have parasite management. And that's it. Let's go over the rules for the bees again from their point of view. Warm, dry cavity, food and nectar, manage parasites. Anything else that anybody tells you as far as rules for beekeeping is a reflection of that person's biases and opinions, not of the honeybees. Honeybees don't have very many rules. So I do have some suggestions for you. How many of you out there have been keeping bees for less than 3 years? Put your hand up. If you've been keeping bees for less than 3 years. Okay, it looks like a pretty experienced group then. Okay, so what I found with beekeeping is, first thing, it's just basic animal husbandry. If you've done any other kind of animal husbandry, all the same principles apply. The second thing is beekeeping is very, very local. Here in the Sierra foothills where I live, just a 5 miles difference of drive puts you in a whole different environment because we live in the mountains right here. And, and what works in one place may not work in the other place as far as timing. So I would suggest you just copy a consistently successful local beekeeper. Now, the key thing is, what is consistently successful? That is not necessarily a leader in a club or the one who's on the newspaper or on the internet or leading meetings. What that is somebody whose major problem is that every spring they've got too damn many bees and they got to get rid of them. Otherwise, everything's going to swarm or they got to double the number of colonies. So anybody who is purchasing bees, in my opinion, is not a consistently successful beekeeper. People who have very low colony losses and their big problem is having too many bees in the spring, those are the consistent successful. And those are the ones that I would look to for suggestions. And I really like this quote back from 1920 from Tickner Edwards. And he says, "And so the best bee master is always the one who most exactly obeys the orders from the hive." And that is the way I have learned to keep bees, and my sons have learned that we are essentially servants to our bees. And if we serve our bees very, very well, in return, they make us a lot of money in return, and we all get along very, very happily. So the point is, the bees themselves will tell you what they need if you just simply learn how to understand them. First thing to do is be clear on what the business model is of the honeybee superorganism. And what we call that in biology is an ecological niche. For anything else, you just call it a business model. They're exactly the same thing. There's two objectives of the honeybee business model. Number one, to store enough food to survive nectar dearths. And they do that in the form of honey here. So they can do something that no other insect can do. And that is they can keep a regulated warm body temperature for the entire course of the year. No other insects are able to do that. They do that by having all these reserves of energy stored up in the colony right here. Also some protein reserves too. So number one objective, store enough food. Now, that objective is exactly the same as for us beekeepers. We want them to make a lot of honey. So we are aligned on this objective. The second objective is to propagate their genetics via drones and swarming. So the moment they have filled this cavity, there's only one reason to exist as far as honeybee is concerned, that's to send out swarms. to send out offspring right here. So unfortunately, that objective conflicts with our objectives generally, that we want to control swarming. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So understand the two objectives. And the second one right here is I got a whole PowerPoint just on how to manage swarming to your benefit. So I did a colony population here in the thousands over here over 3 different seasons, showing the nectar and pollen flow. And I showed this for my area here in California. And understand the colonies go through 4 phases each year. Once the pollen and nectar become available, they go into the buildup phase and rapidly increase their population. Once the population starts to fill the cavity, they go into reproduction mode, and they start sending out swarms until they come into balance with the cavity size right there. After reproduction, then they can quickly recover their population due to all the sealed brood, and they go into the food storage phase, which ideally peaks with the peak of the honey flow right there. Then once the honey flow tapers off and there's no pollen coming in, they go into dearth mode. Now, notice I didn't put any dates on here. In the Northern Hemisphere, we associate this period of time with the winter solstice, but that just happens to be a coincidence. It has nothing to do with day length, and it really doesn't have much to do with the temperature, other than that it's gets below 55 degrees and they can't fly. If you go down to Southern California or to Mexico, this dearth period, the winter for the bees, occurs in July through September, when it's very warm and the days are long. If you go down to Australia, I've been on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in Australia, and there's a white box nectar and pollen flow on it, and your colonies are foraging like crazy and busting at the seams and whitening wax and producing honey on the shortest day of the year. So forget anything about photoperiod or time of year. It has to simply do with temperature, warm enough for them to fly, and availability of nectar and pollen. Now the queen, beekeepers just love to look at photographs of queen bees. I call it beekeeper porn. You can put up all the pictures of queen bees any day, and beekeepers just love looking at a good picture of a queen bee. And they think that she is magic. Well, you got to realize she is the only normal female in the whole colony. That is the default, to be a reproductive, egg-laying female insect. The special bees in a colony are all these sterile workers, all these females that cannot reproduce. And what they are, they're all daughters of this queen, and they raise their sisters rather than the mother raising their sisters. And these are the fascinating insects in the honeybee colony. The queen is just a normal egg-laying insect right here. She does put out pheromones, and those pheromones are very important for colony regulation and temperament, how they feel and what they do. And she is the mother of all the bees in the colony. But she has very little other influence. She does not call the shots of what's happening in the colony at all. The ones that call the shots are the nurse bees, and those are the workers from about three days to about 15, 20 days old, who have their hypopharyngeal glands fully developed and are producing jelly. The nurses are the ones who respond to the environmental cues, and they decide whether or not to feed the queen, how much food to give her, and whether they are going to rear any of the eggs that she lays into larvae and into workers. They always have the choice. When she lays an egg, the nurse says, oh, am I going to cannibalize this egg and recycle the protein, or am I going to raise a larva? And there's times of the year where they just cannibalize the eggs as fast as the queen lays them. They're also the nurses of only bees in the colony that have the ability with enzymes to digest pollen. They're the only ones that specifically consume pollen to digest. So they function as the digestive stomach for the colony. And if you're doing nosema squashes, where these are Ziploc bags with some water and crushed bees, if I take a sample of nurse bees from inside the hive, you can see all the pollen that was in their guts. Or if you take a sample of foragers, there's no pollen in their guts at all. They are unable to digest it. They are not interested in eating pollen. Neither is the queen bee. Now, this jelly is the shared currency in the colony that they do this process called trophallaxis of digesting it, the pollen, and then producing this jelly made of two different components that gel when they get mixed together. And they transfer this mouth to mouth to all the other bees in the hive. So this communal stomach lets every bee in the hive always know the exact nutritional status of the hive as to how abundant this jelly is, how willing the nurses are to produce and share jelly with the incoming foragers and with the other bees. So the whole colony, because of the nurses doing this sharing, understands the nutritional state of the hive. Now, there's two terms we should have here. One's called attrition, and one's called recruitment. And we should be familiar with these, with looking at like the battle over in Ukraine right now. As long as they can, Ukrainians can continue to recruit new soldiers, they can continue to fight a war. Because they're going to have constant attrition of lost soldiers over there. The moment recruitment falters, then they're going to start losing the war right there. So attrition in the honeybees is loss of workers due to aging. They don't live very long, only about 35 days average longevity during the spring and summer, or from weather, or the wind, or predators out there, or disease such as nosema or viruses. That's the ingrained attrition. Recruitment is the rearing of these new workers right here. And colonies deal with most problems by simply trying to increase recruitment. They just replace the bees that are dying by rearing new bees. So as a beekeeper, the ability to stimulate colonies to recruit new workers will take care of most all problems other than varroa, because varroa, we'll talk about varroa later. But I made this graph right here. Again, colony population, the thousands on the y-axis. This is your daily net change in bee population. So during this linear growth phase right here, they're increasing by about 500 net bees every single day. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of math problem, and I know beekeepers generally aren't very good at math. I'll give you guys a try with your arithmetic. If the queen bee is laying 1,500 eggs a day, and the colony population is increasing by 500 bees a day, how many bees are dying every day from old age? Go ahead, somebody shout it out. 1,000 bees a day during this linear growth are dying of old age every single day. When people say they don't want to do a mite wash and sacrifice 300 bees and pass up on the chance to save the colony, I know what your mite level is, I think, guys, do the arithmetic here. That's nothing. There's 1,000 bees a day dying every single day of natural causes right here. So I made up this graph a few years ago, working with Lloyd Harris, who did his master's thesis on this. He had a monster data set, kind of hard to understand. I said, Lloyd, you mind if I colorize it and put it together in a picture for beekeepers to understand? So on my website, you can take a look at this. And this is tremendously informative right here. This is for Manitoba, Canada, an area that has a fairly long winter season right here. But it shows you the age population of the breakdown of the worker population, with the red being workers that are 0 to 12 days of age. These are oranges, 13 to 24 days, 25 to 36 days of age. Very few workers ever make it past 48 days during the spring or the summer. And then the dotted line is the total amount of immature bees, eggs, larvae, and pupae, which you can see right here is more than you have as adult bees in the hive. You actually have more bees as immatures than you have as adults. And then we have the spring turnover, typical swarming, and the fall turnover here. So we'll go over this, refer back to this graph over the presentation here. What I did is I studied that. I realized you can break the season down into these very different phases of the bee biology and population dynamics right here. So we're going to shoot through these. For more, you can go back to my website, and I have this whole series of articles, Understanding Colony Buildup and Decline, which will go into these in much more detail. So what I suggest is one thing that every club can do, especially for the benefit of the beginning beekeepers, is to make up a graph like this. Take your typical frames of bees in colonies, that you're going to see at any time of year and plot it out right here on a curve. And then do a phenological table, forget the dates, put the bloom of your different things that plants that the bees work on there. And then put in when your typical swarming season is, if you have any toxic pollen or nectar in your area, when your main honey flow is, and when your dearth is. And then this is very handy for planning your strategy because you can work backwards from these dates to make your plans. You can overlay this graph with a management plan right here. And all these graphs are on my first year beekeeping webpage to give you ideas. But you have to do this differently for every place you live. If you make up a plan like this, then people can be proactive beekeepers rather than reactive beekeepers. And you're far more successful if you're a proactive beekeeper rather than a reactive beekeeper. The proactive beekeeper, by the time the reactive beekeeper realizes that's a problem, the proactive beekeeper already solved the problem 2 months earlier because they saw that it could be coming. So what I would suggest is don't ask other beekeepers or even the books for advice or for a plan of what to do. Simply base all your management decisions upon the biological needs of the colony. And before Varroa, people would say, what should I do? And I said, well, if you don't know exactly what you're doing, don't do nothing. Just leave the bees alone. Give them enough room to store honey, and they'll do better without you than they will with you. Unfortunately, nowadays with Varroa mite, that's not true. You really do need to help them out. So my suggestion now is, before you take the cover off a hive, have a plan. Know exactly what you're going to be looking for, exactly what combs you're going to pull to answer those questions, and what you plan to do in response to what you see. Have that all figured out before you ever crack the lid of a hive. A professional beekeeper, a hive inspection is something like 15 seconds. You know exactly what you're looking for. You open it up, find it out, and you've got them closed up and the lid back on before the bees even know that you were in there. So what I suggest, I call this reading the combs. Taking a look at the combs to let you know what you need to do. So what you're going to look for on these combs, you're going to identify where you've got honey, how much bee bread you have, and how much fresh pollen you have. The bee bread typically is darkened and is shiny like this, where the fresh pollen looks more powdery fresh, hasn't been fermented yet. Then you have your open brood, and then you have your sealed brood. And the other name for sealed brood is Varroa food. And this is where you are not only a beekeeper, but you are a Varroa producer. Some of you will probably notice that you're much more successful at being a Varroa producer than you are at being a beekeeper, okay? And what I say is, the only reason Varroa is a problem is that you guys are just poor marketers. If you figured out how to sell Varroa mites for a nickel a piece, you could be rich right now. But nobody's figured out how to develop that market. So the big question then is, when things are happening outside the hive, how do the nurses know what's happening outside? How do they respond to environmental cues? So I'm going to show you the view that the nurses get. People don't realize bees live the first part of their life in total darkness, okay? Sight vision means nothing to them. They respond to environmental cues of smell, taste, and touch. And those cues are brought in by the foragers. So the cues are incoming fresh pollen and incoming nectar. These are, as soon as there's incoming nectar, incoming pollen, that tells the nurses, wow, we should go into buildup mode and we should feed every larva from the eggs that the queen lays. The other big cue is larval pheromone, which cues all the rest of the bees in the hive. They put off a pheromone called E-beta-ocimane, and that means the whole colony knows that they are in buildup mode. So you want, as a beekeeper, want to recognize the cues that trigger nurse behavior. I'm going to go over those three terms again: cue, trigger, and behavior. The cues are what they observe, and the beekeeper is able to produce some of these cues. If you're feeding sugar syrup, you're giving the cue of incoming nectar. If you're feeding pollen sub, you're giving the cue of incoming pollen, okay? By giving and making sure they have plenty of open comb right here, you're giving them a cue that there's larval pheromone and they don't need to swarm. So those cues are really important. Those cues then trigger behavior. So you can change the bees' behavior. You can't change their behavior, but you can trigger different behaviors by managing the cues. So when beekeepers are used to pulling a comb out and seeing this band of bee bread right here, and they assume this is where the forager bees put it preferentially, and that is not true at all. Where they preferentially put it is right here in the newly opened cells next to the brood as the workers emerge from these cells. If they can't find open cells right here, then they put it further and further out to the edge of the brood nest. And if the nurses don't consume it, then it gets converted into bee bread and stored as surplus. So this stuff out here is not stimulatory to the nurse bees. This pollen right here is stimulatory to the nurse bees. So right here, you see where they store it right next to the larvae. Now you don't notice this generally because most people don't look for it. And this is what gets consumed as fast as it's brought in by the nurse bees. The nurse bees never have to touch that pollen band on the outside. If the nurses have eaten all this pollen here, that means there's not enough pollen coming in to satisfy their demand, and they go into their reserves right here. Now, when you're looking at the combs, this is the critical interface right here to pay attention to. Right between where you have the stored honey above and the brood down below, where any pollen might be stored right here. So these are your energy stores right here, and these are your energy and protein demand right here. And this would be any protein reserve here. Now your energy interface is right here. The single line of cells right between any bee bread and the stored honey. If these cells contain fresh nectar, now you have the colony in nectar storage mode, and it's going to be pushing the brood nest down. As these cells get consumed, this bee bread, they will fill them with honey. The protein interface is this edge right between the brood and the bee bread. So if you have a band of bee bread here, that means there's a reserve of protein. If there's no band of stored bee bread, that means they are eating any incoming protein as fast as it's coming in. And a colony does not need to have a band of bee bread in order to grow at full tilt. In the springtime, in many areas, they live hand to mouth, and they eat the incoming pollen as fast as it comes in. By morning, there's no stored bee bread in the colony at all, but they're growing at full tilt. So this just means there's a reserve of surplus. So let's go through the 4 seasons of the year. Okay, so the cue generally in most areas to kick off the buildup is the first tree pollens coming in. In my area, it's the alder trees. They have this yellow pollen right here. We see the alder pollen coming in typically in the second week of January. We know our colonies are going to go into buildup mode. And in Manitoba, Canada, this happened in March with the first tree pollens, and you see when they went and they started building up the brood nest right here. So here's a picture in my area with fresh alder pollen being brought in, big surplus, and here's the first patch of brood that they're rearing off of it. And forget what the books say about tree pollens not being nutritious. At least the alder pollen is totally, completely nutritious and allows bees to rear brood very, very well. Now, when that fresh pollen comes in and stimulates the nurses to produce jelly, now these larvae are in abundance, food abundance, and they will quickly expand the brood nest. The young larvae put off this brood pheromone, E-beta-ocimene, which then tells the foragers, wow, we got young larvae to feed. We better preferentially forage for pollen. And then we hit what's called the spring turnover. You see right here, when these bees initiate brood rearing, that kicks them from their long-lived diutinous physiology to nurse bee physiology. And when the first round of brood starts to emerge, that pushes all these bees off into becoming mid-age bees and foragers, and they have a very short life after that, 8 to 12 days. They will die. So the race is on right here. As this population goes down, they got to rear new replacements. And that's why you have this more brood right now than you have adult bees right here. And notice that there's been almost no loss of worker population when they're in this diatinous state until they start rearing brood, and then they die off very, very rapidly. Look at that, just taper off right here, and they need to rear their replacements during that period of time. One of the problems we see in almond pollination is that there's a major bloom on right off the bat. If you take your bees out of winter storage and put them right on a big bloom like this, they get so excited about foraging. On a bloom like this, a worker bee only lives for about 8 days foraging, and then they wear out. And these colonies can crash because they wear themselves out foraging before the few that stay behind and become nurses can produce enough bees to replace the loss from foraging. So here's a picture in late January in my yard here. Minimal protein reserve. See, almost no stored pollen. A little tiny bit right here. Nice patch of brood. So these are the geriatric workers. They've survived through the winter up to this point, desperately trying to get their replacements reared and to keep them warm. And then we get parasite problems. And there's a seasonality to parasites, okay? So springtime, Nosema and European foulbrood and chalkbrood are problems. You don't have too many problems generally in the middle of the summer. Late in the season, starting in August, Varroa and deforming virus can become big problems. And then during the winter, also you can get the paralytic viruses, and a combination of paralytic viruses and Nosema and Varroa can be very, very rough on the colonies. Understand there's a seasonality to disease. So in the springtime, Nosema. So here's a photo micrograph I took. This is a bee's trachea right here. This is the midgut tissue of the bee at 400 times magnification. Every one of these little white ovals is a Nosema environmental spore. You can see they just fill the gut tissues full of spores. And they take a lot of energy and protein to do that. They suppress the immunity of the worker bees. So here's a picture I took in very early February, where we still have frosty nights. And one look at this frame says, oh my gosh, this colony is struggling with Nosema right now. Because if you're having frosty nights, there's not enough adult bees on this comb to keep this amount of brood warm on a frosty night. They are stretched to the absolute max. So you can tell by looking at this picture that attrition is exceeding recruitment. These are the old bees rearing this big batch of brood, but they're not going to be able to do it if they are infected by Nosema. And if Nosema ceranae hits them hard, this colony, this frame can look like that in a couple of days. Look at this, the ring of bee bread here. That tells you this was solid brood out to that border before that frosty night. This is what we saw during what was called CCD in the early 2000s. Very, very typical sign right here of very strong Nosema ceranae infection. And a lot of times you just see a silver dollar size patch of bees and the queen. If I take these bees one at a time and put them under the scope, checking for Nosema, 8 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 would be infected with Nosema. So that would cause this rapid collapse. We don't see this much anymore. I rarely see it anymore. But we saw a lot of that during CCD. Now, one of the things that people get confused by, they think that this indicates Nosema. This is called dysentery. And that means the bees' rectums are just full of too much moisture, and they just can't wait. They can barely hold it. When they fly out, they just let it loose and squirt. So this is not a symptom of Nosema. Nosema has, as far as I know, has never, ever been shown to cause dysentery. But if the bees have dysentery, that definitely can spread Nosema spores. So don't confuse dysentery and Nosema. They're two different things. The only way you can identify Nosema is by looking under a microscope. I just had a new beekeeper over just a couple of days ago, and we went through microscopy, so I could show them slides like this, where you see a bee hair, a seta right here, these feathery hairs they have. Here would be a pollen grain here and a pollen grain, and these would be spores of Nosema ceranae right here. Nosema serrani spores are a little more elongated than Nosema apis spores. These all look like Nosema serrani right here. So I call Nosema an enigma because it doesn't normally have that much effect upon a well-nourished, strong colony with a young queen. But if you have a low percentage of the bees infected by Nosema, it's not a big deal. When you get to 6 or more out of 10 bees, 60% or more infected with Nosema, then a colony slows down considerably. And by the time you have 8 or 10 bees infected, then the colony can actually go towards collapse. But at that, like 5, if half the bees are infected, the spring turnover is going to be more slow and the buildup slow and the honey production will be suppressed somewhat, but it doesn't normally kill the colony. Now, if they get past that, the spring turnover and there's plenty of pollen coming in, they go into the linear growth phase. And it's just a straight linear growth at this very high rate until the attrition rate due to adult longevity comes in equilibrium with the egg laying rate of the queen. So when your equilibrium is reached at about 40 times the recruitment rate. So if the queen is laying 1,000 eggs a day and the workers are rearing them all, you're going to reach a population of about 40,000 bees. If they're rearing 1,500 workers every day, you're going to reach a population of 60,000 bees. And this goes on for about 40 days until that equilibrium is reached. See right here with the Lewis data, this very quick growth right here. Now, these colonies they consume their food reserves very, very quickly. Oh, wow. And you can be in danger of starvation. There's a complete turnover of these bees roughly once every month. It takes about 1 to 2 pounds of pollen every single week. And you can see them expanding up into their honey stores here, very little protein reserve living hand to mouth. If it rains, they very quickly are depleted. And Carl Quailsheim showed that by putting sprinklers on hives, within 45 minutes of turning the sprinklers on, the nurses start cutting back on the amount of jelly they feed to the larvae. And you can see in Lloyd's data right here, when I checked weather history, there was a cold storm with rain and snow came in here, and they immediately started cannibalizing their brood. And here's us, my son's out here in a late April snowstorm, after we'd already supered up all these singles that we had split from almonds. They were building up on a honey flow, and and it rained right here. And man, when this came, most beekeepers in our county had lost all their hives. Okay, 4 days later, that's what those colonies looked like. They'd cannibalized all their brood, eaten all their honey, eaten all of their pollen reserves, only leaving a very few sealed brood. Luckily, in our operation, that didn't happen. I'll show you a picture in a minute. So this is also springtime starvation. This can happen later on in the season. So this is one of the nukes from last year, that when with climate change, we're not getting the nectar flows that we used to, and we need to start putting more honey into our nukes than we have over the last 40 years. Otherwise, we get these very brief starvations that happen. Very really makes us feel bad anytime that we see one of our colonies starve. This is a sign of starvation. So here's a picture of me treating my bees better than I treat my own offspring. When we get rain and snow in the springtime, my boys grew up saying, "Okay, Dad, get the foul weather gear on." And we often work for a month straight in the spring, wearing foul weather gear every single day, doing bee work. What we do for the bees doesn't change. The plan is the same. The only thing we change is just what we wear, our clothing. And somebody asked me, "Randy, you guys are out feeding your bees when it's raining and snowing?" I said, well, duh. When it's warm and sunny, they feed themselves. Your job as a beekeeper is to help your bees when they can't feed themselves. So we do a lot of this. We may feed them also. They need a lot of moisture for brood rearing, and they do not take advantage of the moisture on the grass here at all. So if they can't fly, they get very thirsty. So we'll create an artificial nectar flow with sugar syrup. Okay, here's a quick inspection. I guess I got to really speed up right here. Quick inspection from a center frame from the upper brood chamber is all you generally need to know. One glance at this and a beekeeper says, "Oh, this colony is fine. Close it back up. 2 minutes. Okay, we'll see how far I get. Healthy brood, spotty brood. Now, in the late summer, this is normal. That just means the nurses are cannibalizing the brood. In the springtime, that's bad. We're going to look at your larval age progression here. See the step down here on ages? Good larval survival means you have even progression, very few taken out. If you have mixed larvae, different ages, that means you got some kind of disease or something happening in that colony. Then figure out what the problem is. Often it's going to be chalk brood or European foul brood. Generally, if you have mixed pollens, it's good nutrition. And what we've learned to do is to look at the amount of jelly for the nutritional status. So these larvae are being fed very well. You can do no wrong as a beekeeper. These bees can handle anything because their recruitment rate is going to be so high right here. So look for the abundant jelly. When they start cutting back the amount of jelly they feed the larvae, that means that the colony is nutritional stress. So swimming in jelly, nutritional stress. Okay, boy, we're only up to the swarming impulse right here. So when the cavity is full of sealed brood, that tells them that they filled the cavity, it's ready to go. Fresh nectar starts coming in, and no larvae can be reared, no room for them, and no young larval pheromone. That lack of young larval pheromone tells the colony either the queen is failing or we filled the cavity. In either case, we got to start rearing queen cells, and they do. So you can help to manage swarming by simply giving combs of empty cells immediately above the brood nest, and that will allow the queen to continue laying, produce more young larval pheromone. That will suppress swarming greatly. On the other hand, if you get to this point, it's too late. You got to make splits. So that's what we do. We make about 3,000 nukes every single spring. We sell 1,000, keep 2,000 for ourselves. Here's colony reproduction taking place. You want to avoid swarming at all costs. One is that it reduces your honey crop. Two, you can be a nuisance. Three, if the swarm survives and establishes, now you have a competitor out there. And most of the mites are left in the parent hive. About 70% of the mites are left in the parent hive. So it's going to really have a hard time. And your escape swarms, if they establish, become varroa factories where you get mites drifting back in. Now your sealed brood, you got to realize a single frame of sealed brood will emerge into 3 frames covered with workers. So that colony, after it swarms, can establish its population very quickly. That's why you can pull a nuke out of every colony in order to avoid swarming, because these guys can recover. Finally, get to the main honey flow. I'm going to blast through these right here. Understand that the stronger the colony, they make proportionally more honey. So what we do, we combine all of our weaker colonies at the beginning of the honey flow, so they make the maximum honey crop. Then the honey flow begins, and nectar comes pumping in right here. It forces the brood nest down. They get their wax glands, come into production, and you start seeing white wax. And this tells you is that they are out of space, and it's time to give them more room. It's the only time you can draw a foundation. There's no magic for drawing foundation. You have to have colonies showing white wax. And then they reach a balance, I'm not going to go into it, that balances the number of mid-age bees as food processors and comb builders to equal the number of foragers. And brood rearing is deprioritized. They fill the brood nest then full of nectar, so the queen can't lay eggs because they don't want to rear any more mouths to feed right now. And then we trick the colony by giving them extra room, so now they don't realize that the cavity isn't filled. They don't realize they should be swarming, and they just keep putting on more honey right here. And finally, things dry up, population goes down. They eliminate any extra mouths to feed. Poor pattern right here, they're cannibalizing the brood. And when varroa becomes an issue to us. You can use my varroa model to help plan your varroa management strategy. And what happens is, as the bee population goes down, the mite population slowly increases, but your infestation rate increases very, very quickly. Your best bet is to control mites very early in the season, before swarming season, and that makes the rest of the year's control much easier. Typically, it's going to take between 2 to 4 treatments a year to keep the row levels down. Come fall, you start getting pollen again. Make sure it is pollen. This is blackberry rust fungus here, and we get in our area, and the colonies, the brood starts to die. Now, they're going to start forming the winter bees. These winter bees live for a long time until they start rearing brood rearing, when they suddenly drop off. So we control mites first, and then we feed pollen sub in order to get them to build up that winter cluster. If they don't eat it, we just walk away from them. So we're feeding pollen sub. They cease rearing brood when there's no more pollen coming in. Emerging workers go into survival mode, and they develop their fat bodies to make it through the winter. The fall turnover, about half the bees just fly off and die of old age, and they form the winter cluster. We're going to go through this quickly. Top insulation helps a whole lot. Top ventilation is of questionable benefit. And then you have these long-lived workers that make it through the winter right here until they start rearing brood. They may initiate a little bit of brood rearing, and that's probably for water balance, to get rid of the moisture in their guts, and then get rid of that by converting it into jelly, by absorbing it from the gut and putting it into the glands and feeding it off to the larvae to avoid dysentery. And here they are rearing brood in the middle of winter right there. And what we almond pollinators, we start feeding pollen stuff in January to stimulate this late winter brood rearing. Finally, the first tree pollens come in, alder again, and we're back to the beginning. Sorry, I had to accelerate towards the end there, guys. All right. I don't know if we have time for questions or not.
One minute. A question? Yeah, go ahead.
Randy, you made the comment that top entrances might not have value.
Yeah.
Why would you say that?
Because looking at all the research, there's very few places in the world where there's been any findings that suggest they actually do have a value. When you put a top entrance and a bottom entrance in, that's like imagine you live in a 2-story house during winter. Don't take my word for this. Try this, okay? Is it cold at your area now?
Yes.
Okay, so turn off the heater, open the front door, and open the top window, and see how it feels living in that house.
What about the moisture content? How's the condensation getting out of the hive?
So there's no reason for condensation if the hive is insulated enough. So generally, top insulation will put the condensation to the outside of the hive, to the where it reaches dew point temperature. That's the moisture the bees need in order to have enough moisture during the winter. So small colonies, small clusters tend to have more condensation issues. Large clusters actually get too thirsty and they can die of thirst. So there was a great study by Jeffries in Scotland years ago where he combined 2 colonies together going into the winter, and those colonies die of thirst. They get too hot and thirsty. So if you have a condensation issue, it may very well be because you're trying to winter too small a cluster of bees. By putting in what you want is that moisture to condense on the side of the hive, and then water gatherers can go over there and get that and bring that in to provide enough moisture for the bees in the middle of the cluster.
Thank you.
You bet.
What environment are you in that is in that environment?
What
Radio.
environment? Go ahead.
Did you hear that one?
Something about what environment am I in?
Where are you located?
I'm up in the mountains in Northern California. We don't get as cold as you guys. We get below freezing. We're below freezing at night right now, but we don't get as cold as you do. But what I've done is I've taken a lot of look at this, all over the world, from all the research and all the trials that have been done, and there's been very few places where I found where top ventilation appears to be a benefit. Now, top flight entrance is a whole different thing. So a top flight entrance can be a benefit, But that flight entrance should not be at the very top of the hive. It should be down just at the bottom of the cluster, like midway up in the hive, with a wind block over the front of it, so you don't get wind in there. So otherwise, if you do a top entrance as the bottom entrance, then you have a thermosiphoning effect that the bees cannot control easily unless they plug up the top entrance with propolis. If you only have just entrance near the bottom or midway up, then they can control their ventilation much better.
Any questions for Mr. Oliver?
Are you still the boss?
Well, I kind of I've I handed the reins over to my sons about 3 years ago, and they're actually doing well. They made good money the first couple of years. This last year, every natural disaster you can imagine and several you can't imagine hit them. They had yards washed away by floods. They had fires. They had drought. They had massive bear damage. They had trees blowing down on colonies. They had right at the spring turnover, a big cold snowstorm. They were about ready to, they didn't even know if they were going to be able to fill their pollination contracts and ready to walk away. They so discouraged. And I said, well, just hang on, guys. This is the worst year I've seen in 40 years. And believe it or not, they wound up making a good honey crop and are back making money again. So they stuck with it. So they just paid $10,000 to get one of the trucks fixed. So they're doing okay. So but the deal was I'm handing them over the operation with the condition that I've got anytime I want, I can say, hey, I need 100 colonies for this research project. I need another 100 colonies for this. So I typically have 300 to 400 colonies at any time in various research projects while they are running the operation for a profit.
I just like to say I really appreciate the scientific work you're doing for the practical beekeeper.
Well, that's the thing that I see as missing, especially in the United States. In the worldwide, there's other countries, they do much more applied research. The US, the amount compared to what we used to get with the USDA and stuff, there's not that much applied research going on. And that's so frustrating to me because that's what beekeepers need. And that's why the demand for me right now, I just got back from speaking in Germany. I'm going to Peru in 2 days to help them down there. I'm then going to go to Slovenia after that. And beekeepers around the world are just dying for practical applied research findings so they can use biology to manage their bees. And I got sucked into this. This is no plan. I'll tell you right now. I was just happy as being a beekeeper here, but I just happen to have the background in biology and being a professional beekeeper that there's not a whole lot of them out there who have those two backgrounds.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, guys. Happy beekeeping to you all. Good luck. Have a great winter there.
Thanks, Randy.